Good evening and welcome to our show. The national and New York State elections will present voters with critically important choices on key fiscal issues as well as important social issues. Our national debt crisis is most serious and over the next decade will likely get even worse. Unemployment is now more than 50% above the normal rate, and home values, the chief asset for most people, have dropped significantly due largely to mounting foreclosures. Tonight, all these issues will be discussed with our guests, George Marlin and Frank Russo. George Marlin was a former candidate for mayor of New York City and is president of a financial company and serves as the Nassau Interim Financial Authority Board of Directors, which has overseen several financial crises facing the county, one of our nation's wealthiest counties. Frank Russo is currently president of the American Family Association of New York and serves on the executive committee of Long Islanders for Educational Reform and Nassau County's Conservative Party. Frank is married for 47 years with 7 children and 31 grandchildren. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thanks for having us.
Frank, to you first. What is your view of the long-term fiscal issues facing our nation today, and how do you think they'll be dealt with? Do you think that there's any optimism on these issues?
I am not that optimistic, in all honesty. I think George is more optimistic than I am. We have a national debt of about $14 trillion, which just happens to equal our national GDP, gross domestic product. That's the total amount of goods and services produced in our nation in a year. Is also equal to our our national debt.
That's a mind-boggling statistic.
It is
right
incredible. And we're running up we're adding another trillion in deficit this year. So each year it's going up by another $1 trillion, at least in recent years. On top of that, we have 2 major programs for senior citizens, Social Security, and I'm one of these Medicare Social Security recipients, but Social Security and Medicare, which have an accumulative deficit, underfunded liability, of roughly $42 trillion, $35 trillion unfunded for Medicare, $7 trillion unfunded for Social Security. That's based on the best estimates I've seen. This is incredible when you think of that amount of money. We've got to do something about it, but people, seniors included, don't want to give up anything. And in all honesty, I don't think that's going to work. We're going to have to give up something. We're going to either have to take lower increases in Social Security or do something with Medicare, pay more for Medicare. But somehow we've got to make some adjustment. We've got to change the costs maybe of health insurance. Something has to be done. These things have to be addressed. We'll see what George has to say.
It certainly can't continue the way it is. George?
No, it cannot. First on the national debt, right now we're running deficits of $1 trillion a year. So, 10 years ago, when the Clintons left office at the end of the century, we had a balanced budget for about 15 minutes. We got involved in war, and that started bringing up the deficit to several hundreds of millions of dollars. But now we've reached a point where it's over $1 trillion a year. And what we're seeing, a lot of it was rationalized in terms of a stimulus program, which based on the projections of that stimulus program, unemployment today was supposed to be at 7%. It's now at 9.1%. So the stimulus program failed and proved once again that government spending money, throwing bags of money around all over the nation, doesn't have a positive impact in growing the economy.
That's a good point.
That's the failure of the program. But now we're paying for this program. And so we have to get back to a baseline that gets the deficit under control, because right now what has been guiding the economy is the Federal Reserve Board, has been buying up all this debt and keeping interest rates almost at zero. The hope being this would jump kick the economy, but because of all the uncertainties in the economy, major corporations, it's not inducing them to take all the cash they're sitting on, corporations around America, and start investing into their companies, start investing into hiring people, because the uncertainties on Obamacare, on taxes, on a host of other issues out there, they're saying, let's keep our powder dry and cash is king. So all the stimulus money we've seen has not brought around this economy. In fact, many economists now agree we're going into a second double dip recession here, which means, we're going to see inflation kicking in. We're going to see stagflation. Unemployment high, inflation high. We haven't seen that since the Carter years. That's what's right around the corner. So that's issue 1. Issue 2, which Frank addressed, was the unfunded liability on Social Security, Medicare. We don't know how to handle a $15 trillion deficit, accumulated deficit that we're funding right now. Do you think we're going to be able to fund $45 billion in unfunded liability for Social Security and Medicare? The answer is no. Trillion.
Of course
The
not.
answer is no. That's why Obamacare has rationing of care. Their answer is simple. Let's get rid of old people. That's what it's coming down to. We're going to ration care and say, well, you're old, you've had a good life. No, I'm sorry, we're not going to give you this medical care anymore. That's the only answer. You know, that's answer A, which to me is the wrong answer. Answer is B, is you have to reorganize the entire entitlement programs in America and reorganize the entire entitlement mentality in this nation, because we can no longer afford it. And if we continue on this track, we're going to become like Europe, which Greece and Poland and Spain and Italy are going broke and going right down the rat hole. They have riots in the streets because when they say, we may have to cut your 12 weeks vacation a year down to 9, they have riots in the streets in France and Spain and other places. So
Because they've gotten so used to the
it's
entitlement
become a way of life. Well, the
mentality, they
entitlement
don't want
mentality becomes a permanent way of life. Nobody works in France. All they're concerned about is their holidays. You know, work days is a place just to hang out for a few hours every day while they're waiting to take their 3 months vacation and retire at 48 and do whatever. So that's become generations, which becomes a way of life. But the day of reckoning has come, and these countries in Europe are going broke. So we're going down that road. We're going to be like old Europe if we continue this, and I'm hoping that is not the trend. But there has to be some dramatic and gutsy actions taken, or we're going to fall right over the fiscal abyss.
Well, George raises a good point that it's very hard to change the status quo after things have been the way they are for so long. How would you see overturning this?
Well, in my judgment, and George is going to disagree with me on one part of it, on the tax part of it, but I think the problem has to be dealt with, in my judgment, 85% with cutting government spending. But where George will disagree with me, I think 20% of the problem has to be dealt with increased taxes, unfortunately. And that's where I'll side with the Democrats. The Republicans are basically more in the right with cutting spending, but I think we're going to have to do something on the taxes. And specifically, I'd favor increasing the taxes on true millionaires. The Democrats talk about a millionaire's tax, but they apply that tax to anyone earning $200,000 or $250,000. So they're not millionaires. At least not how I define a
Sure, that
millionaire,
would
someone
put
with a
many
million
more
of income.
people into
Exactly.
that category.
Exactly. So I would raise it on people truly making $1 million or more, couples making $1 million or more, raise it maybe 2%, the tax rate. I would also, I do favor taxing estates, say over $5 million or $10 million, to accommodate people who own small businesses, and when they die, you don't want to have to force them to sell in order to pass it on to their heirs. So I would, and I want to encourage people to save. If you don't have any exemption, people are not going to be encouraged to save. So I would have and I think both parties are talking about a $3.5 million to $5 million exemption for estate taxes. I favor that. But after that, I do favor a tax, but not the excessive rates that they've had in the past, 55%, 45%. I would limit it at about a third of the estate, and I think that's a reasonable thing to do. I think the corporate tax rates have got to be reduced also in the nation. 35. That's why we have one of the highest corporate tax rates in the world. That's why businesses are encouraged to go to other countries rather than the United States. So I'd reduce it from 35.
ridiculous.
That's right. 35% is too high. I'd lower it to 25%. But on the other side, I'd eliminate this monstrous number of loopholes that too many businesses get because their lobbyists know how to get it out of certain politicians, senators, and representatives. So we've got
It's
to eliminate.
amazing that hasn't been taken care of already.
Nope, and I don't even know. I'm not optimistic that they're going to. They've got to reduce it for the average company and eliminate the loopholes for these companies that have paid all these lobbyists to get. Now, certain loopholes might be beneficial if they can justify it with sound economic principles. Fine, but in the
Sure.
majority of cases, it's not justified.
Sure. George, do you want to respond to that?
Well, I see there's this double-edged sword here. Frank, on the one hand, wants to raise some taxes but lowers the corporate taxes. Why do you want to lower corporate taxes? Because high taxes take away incentive for rich people to invest and be entrepreneurial. The reason why we are losing businesses in this company and we're not getting investments in companies in this nation is because the corporate income tax is too high. They go to England, it's dramatically lower. So why stay here? It pushes people away. Similarly, if you tax individuals too high, they will find loopholes. In the past, it's always been, well, why should I invest in a company if I take a huge risk where I could lose everything and have zero in a new venture, or get the benefits if it works? If you overtax the benefits, they say, well, on a net-net basis, if it all goes right, I'm going to have as much as I would get putting it, say, in municipal bonds, which basically don't create a job. They just sit there, and you clip your coupon every quarter, and you get some money, and that's the end of that. So rich people don't like paying taxes. It's a fact of life. I've been dealing with them all my life. They will nickel and dime over things you cannot believe to save $5 in taxes. Tom Galazzano, who created tens of thousands of jobs in the state, founded a company called Paychex. He made an announcement last year that he was leaving the state of New York because to live in Florida, where there's no state income tax, would save him $5 million a year.
So
he
it
moved to
became
Florida.
a no-brainer for him.
No brainer. And you could still spend 180 days a year in New York, so it's like, who cares? I'm leaving town. So if you push taxes too high, capital gains taxes, every time you raise them, the federal government gets less income from the raised tax. That's fact. The lower they are, the more revenue you get. The objective here is to grow the economy where you get more tax revenue because the economy has grown. And to do that, you must establish an environment that gives people incentive to make investments. Too much regulations, too much Obamacare, too high taxes, too high capital gains tax. It's a disincentive to people.
It's not exactly supporting them.
And that's
Excuse
why
me.
the economy, one of the reasons why the economy is going nowhere right now, because of all this uncertainty of what's going to happen over the next year or two. Corporations, for the most part, most of them are in good shape. They have a lot of cash, they've cleaned up their books, they bought back a lot of stock, but they're sitting on cash. They're afraid to expand their company and hire because they don't know what's going to cost them. They
Everything's
don't know
on
what
pause.
Obamacare is going to be all about. So uncertainty breeds people just sitting back and
Inaction.
doing nothing. Sit on cash, cash is king. And that's what's happening right now, and it's one of the reasons we're probably hitting a double-dip recession.
What do you think of that, Frank?
No, I agree mostly with what George said. I'm ready for question 2.
Okay. Well, if we have no disagreement, we'll move along. To the extent that these issues are not dealt with properly, what do you see as the likely consequence, and who would be the main victims of the situation?
Yeah, the likely consequence is, in my judgment, and I'm reading more and more people saying this, is a possible financial collapse in the United States, where the dollar today is viewed as the currency of the world, and it's been like this since World War II, replacing the British pound, and countries are constantly using dollars in trading. Russia and China will have used dollars, but in recent years they're moving away from the dollar.
From it being the standard.
From being the standard, because there's a risk now to the U.S. currency because of our cumulative debt, gross debt of $14 trillion. That each year we're running up another $1 trillion of deficit, spending more than we take in by $1 trillion. Plus the entitlement program, Social Security and Medicare.
The instability.
It's concern over the future of the dollar and are we going to be able to continue doing what we've been doing, and who's going to be the victims of this deficit problem and entitlement program that people like, I'm on Social Security, I'm on Medicare, but we can't continue getting all the benefits we're getting without someone suffering. And the people that I think are going to suffer are our children and our grandchildren, because we're passing on to them tens of trillions of dollars of debt that we're enjoying the benefits of, and we're asking them to pay. So I see that as unfair. We've got to face up to it, and yet, in all honesty, from what I see, and maybe it's out of ignorance, most people don't seem willing to give up anything. What they call it are entitled to, they think they paid into Medicare. Well, they didn't pay for enough. They didn't pay enough for Medicare. We didn't pay. I didn't pay enough. I didn't pay enough for Social Security. Since we didn't pay enough, we're not really entitled. I mean, they made some errors in calculations or whatever, and that's the decision. We're going to have to face up to it and give up something, or we're going to be selfish. And I am not sure how many people are willing to do the fair and just thing.
George, your response?
Short-term and long-term, people will suffer. Short-term, what is going to be happening in this nation, interest rates have been kept artificially low by the Federal Reserve Board, has been buying up all the treasuries that have been issued to fund the deficit of the United States government. When that stops, and that will stop because it cannot go on forever, it may stop within the next 3 or 4 months, what is going to happen is interest rates are going to start going up, because people are going to demand a higher return for taking a risk of borrowing with all this borrowing that's going to take place. That will drive up local interest rates for tax-exempt bonds for municipalities who use them to fund projects and fund cash flows, etc. So as interest rates go up, we're going to see inflation kicking in. And inflation could kick in to like we experienced it back in the Carter years, where suddenly interest rates on mortgages hit a height, if you recall, to 21%. Prices went up on the average 10 or 15% a year. We saw tremendous inflation. Who suffers? The poor in particular, because they're seeing all their earnings being eaten up in inflation. You know, if gas goes from $2 a gallon to $5 a gallon, well, you have less income to buy food, to buy clothes, to buy other things, to educate your
Pay for
kids,
heat.
pay for heat, the whole caboodle. Senior citizens who lived on fixed income and are stuck in bonds where they're getting returns of 1 or 2%, where that same bond now gets 7 or 8 or 9 or 10%, they can't go anywhere with those bonds because their value, dollar value, has declined dramatically. That's what happened in the late 70s.
So they're stuck.
They're stuck. They're living on less income. They're seeing inflation eat away what income they have. So that's the short term, okay? And middle class suffers. Everybody suffers with inflation, unless you've got a ton of money where it doesn't matter to you, but most people suffer as a result of that. Frank's right about the long-term effect. We have now funded out stuff going out 30 years, 40 years. We're seeing on the local government level, for years, Democrats would tax and spend, Republicans would borrow and spend. So we've seen municipalities borrow, and generally, when you borrow, issuing municipal bonds for a given municipality, it's generally for construction of things. So it has a life. You build a bridge, you build a hospital, you build a building, you build a road, or fix a road. Now more and more municipalities have been using that to fund operating debt. And that's how the city of New York went broke in 1975, where they were issuing short-term debt to fund their budget. And it turned out the short-term debt was basically funding 40, 50% of the budget, and the musical chairs ended, and New York City went into a technical default at one point in time, but then the largest city in the United States went broke. There are lessons to be learned from that. Were not learned by a lot of municipalities.
Apparently.
We're seeing it on a federal level. We're seeing it at state level. The music has to stop playing. And if you don't have a chair, you're in trouble. And those days are coming. So there's a short-term effect, a long-term effect, and it's disastrous any way you slice it, in my mind.
It does sound inevitable. Do you want to
That's it.
respond to
No,
that?
that's
Frank?
it. I agree with
Okay.
it, yeah.
Now, moving along from the national issue to the state issue, what about New York's fiscal situation?
Yeah, New York is also in serious, serious trouble. Governor Cuomo has made some cuts. I was surprised and pleasantly surprised. And the one thing that New York has to its advantage over other states is that at least its pension funds are more fully funded than most other states. However, the amount of the pensions liability that we have is continuing to grow at an enormous rate because our pensions are among the most generous in the country. We're paying typical teachers in the suburbs of New York City pensions of $75,000, now even $80,000 to teachers who retire.
I don't think the average taxpayer realizes that.
No, they don't understand. I spoiled this information in my school district, and that's back several years ago when it was $75,000 average pension for a teacher that retired back in 2008. I'd venture to say now it's closer to $80,000, free of state income taxes.
And then, of course, there's more and more of them because there's more administrators
Yes.
now in the school
Oh,
districts.
absolutely right. And the pension, because the pension funds lost so much money, they're having to increase the rates at which taxpayers put money into these pension funds. Policemen are getting pensions typically in the $90,000 to $100,000 range. This is in the suburbs, not the city policemen, but the suburban police. So we've got to address these problems. These are wonderful people. For the record, my mother, my wife were teachers, public school teachers. My father-in-law was a retired city policeman. But we've got to be more fair and reasonable.
It can't continue like that.
Can't continue. And we've got to address the high compensation levels that public employee unions are getting. Back 50 years ago, 60 years ago, they got all these generous benefits, health care and pensions that were much better than private industry because their salaries were so much lower. But now their salaries are equal and in many
So they
cases
have both.
higher. That's right. So
Do you think in addition to the public not really being aware of that problem, another part of it is the teachers' unions that want to keep this quiet and perpetuate
Absolutely.
the status quo?
Not just it's all the public employee unions. They are very, very powerful, wonderful people. I mean, and the teachers, by the way, are very reasonable. Many of them.
A lot of individual teachers don't belong to the teachers' unions, the
I think
main ones.
Yeah, they have to belong. In New York State, I think they have to join. Not that they have to.
I thought there were a few alternatives to the main liberal ones.
I'm not too sure of that.
Okay, maybe I'm
I
mistaken.
don't think so. I think they have to belong. They're pretty much all public employees belong to these unions, and it's the union leaders. And I don't even want to fault them because they're simply doing what comes natural to get as much money, as much in benefits for as
To
little
speak
extra
for their
work
own
as possible.
benefit.
That's right. But I really fault the politicians for caving into that. So now it's time for our state legislature in Albany to deal with major reforms in pensions and other areas that they control. Some things are controlled by local cities and towns and villages, but a lot of it is controlled by Albany. And pensions is one of the key things controlled by Albany that they've got to deal with.
That's a good point. George, do you want to respond to that?
Well, two issues. First, the fiscal issue concerning the state of New York. The state of New York was a typical example where spending over the last 20 years was increasing on the average about 3 times the rate of inflation. So you cannot keep that cooking forever because the day of reckoning eventually
Obviously.
comes. Secondly, New York State, because manufacturing has died in the state of New York, let's keep in mind that the city of Buffalo in 1960 had 800,000 people. It's now down to 240,000 people. So we have upstate, no job opportunities. Manufacturing has died up there. As a result, not only have we seen 1.2 million people move out of New York State since the year 2000 because they're looking for job opportunities. Elsewhere, the tax system, the regulatory system, the environmental regulations, none of this is conducive for companies to open businesses here when they go from Buffalo, where the weather stinks, to Greenville, South Carolina, where the weather's nicer and they treat you extremely well. People are pulling out. They're voting with their feet by moving out of the state of New York. When you increase spending, on the average 3 times the inflation rate for years, it sort of catches up. And what happened is New York State became overly dependent on the financial sector, Wall Street. And when Wall Street blew up, the revenues of the state of New York went down dramatically. And instead of making incremental cuts and keeping increase in spending to the rate of inflation, no, they took all the stimulus money that came from Washington and used it as a one-shot. Instead of using that money to build roads and do infrastructure, we got bridges falling down, literally falling down all over the state. No, they took it to keep bureaucrats employed in the state of New York. Then the stimulus money ran out. So this year, New York State, for the fiscal year that began April 1st, had a budget projected deficit of $10 billion. That is a huge hole in your budget. To his credit, Governor Cuomo has tried to handle that. He's kept the increases this year basically flat. But more important, what we discovered for the first time, structurally, the state of New York, contributions to local education and to Medicaid, was structurally by law had to increase annually north of 10%. It was fixed in law. And this was like one of the great, I've done a little writing, a little investigation on New York State finances. This was like one of the great kept secrets. And suddenly the governor even figured this out as the new governor said, wait a minute, this is going to come to an end. So for this year budget and next year budget, he's contained it basically to inflation, those increases. What he has to change yet is he has a victory for this year and next year. That gives him the next 2 years to recodify or to abolish these laws that say education contributions must increase by 10%, 10 or 12%, Medicaid by 13%. That has to come to an end. It cannot sustain itself.
So he's made a small effort, but a lot more needs to
no,
happen.
listen, this is just the beginning. Here's what we have to keep in mind. Take the city of New York, for instance. There are 4 million households in the city of New York. 40,000 of those 4 million households pay 51% of the city income tax. Okay?
Wow.
That's 40,000 families out of 4 million pay more than half the city income tax. If 5,000 of those, say, many of whom already own second homes in Florida and tax-free states, say, I'm leaving, it will cripple the tax collection system in the city of New York, because we're basically, a lot of people aren't paying taxes.
On them.
Too dependent on the small sliver of people. So that's the great danger. If the Bush tax cuts expire, Obama's reelected and they do expire, because I assume he will veto any overrun, because it's his last term, he doesn't care anymore. If you're living in the city of New York, your total tax burden will go up to about 60%. Well, why would you live here?
What would the incentive be? Of course.
You'll leave town, like Tom Galazzano did, I explained earlier. So you're going to see an outflow of people who have money to move. Right now, you could buy homes in Florida for next to nothing. Even if you take a loss on your house here, you'll be ahead of the game down in Florida. Or if you don't have a mortgage on your house, it doesn't matter.
I've had enough.
Adios. And that's so we have to see. So that's the immediate problem. The second problem is the pension problem, where Frank is right. We cannot sustain the outgoing money of these pension systems. Right now, relative to other states, he's correct. Our pension system's in pretty good shape. However, the assumption of return right now is 7.5%, and that's very difficult to attain. So what we're going to be seeing is local school districts, municipalities, towns, villages, etc. Right now, on the average, they contribute 8% of their budget. A school district budget goes to pension contributions. Over the next 5 years, that number is going to go from 8% probably up to around 20%.
Which comes out of taxpayer money.
That's correct, which means property taxes will continue to go up even if day-to-day operating spending is flat. So
I don't think the average person understands that.
no. And if you notice the cap that's being passed in Albany, which is a good thing, I don't argue it, and this is a very blue state, so I don't expect miracles. The exemption is going to be on the 2% to pensions contributions. Now, E.J. McMahon of the Manhattan Institute points out right now that'll make the cap about 3.5%, which is better. I live in the New Hyde Park School District. My taxes for this year are going up close to 7%. Last year went up 8%, so I'll take 3.5 over 8. But that pension portion is going to keep on growing, and again, the day of reckoning is coming because you're paying these huge pensions, and the system cannot sustain itself. New York City cops get out at half pay or plus with overtime at 40 years old. These were pension rules that were passed for the days of Ralph Cramden bus drivers. Frank pointed out, you got less pay, you got security in return, you got a modest pension. Now,
It was more balanced.
It was more balanced. Those days are over. The average government worker makes $68,000, while the average private sector worker makes $48,000. So the world has changed dramatically since the 30s, 40s, and 50s.
Okay, we're at about the midway point in our program. We have a very lively discussion going here, but we are going to take a break for a public service announcement. We'll be right back.
My hero hasn't traveled the world. Doesn't star on her own TV show. Can't sing very well. My hero didn't plan on being pregnant. Put her career on hold. Chose to have and love me. My hero, my mom.
If you're facing an unplanned pregnancy, learn more today about parenting or adoption. While there are unwanted pregnancies, there are no unwanted children.
My hero isn't able to slam dunk. Doesn't make $1 million a year. Can't rap at all. My hero helped my mom when she was pregnant. Takes care of us. Chose to have and love me. My hero, my dad.
If you're facing an unplanned pregnancy, learn more today about parenting or adoption. While there are unwanted pregnancies, there are no unwanted children.
Okay, Patty. Patty, you're on.
Welcome back to our show. We're discussing key fiscal issues through 2020. Frank, over to you, continuing on the state issue. How big of a problem do you think educational issues are in our fiscal crisis in New York State?
Well, education and health are the two biggest items that are in our state budget. If you just look at what Albany has to pay, I'd say Medicaid is number one and education is number two. However, when you add in the local cost pay for education, which is the bulk of it, education is the number one area of expenditure of state and local funding. It swamps even healthcare, I believe. Approximately $23 billion of our state budget comes from Albany for education, and approximately $35 billion comes from local property taxes. That's something in the order of $60 billion, close to $60 billion a year, about $19,000 per pupil. We have a little over 3 million public school pupils. That is number one in the nation. Occasionally we fall into second position, but normally and recently we've been number one. We spend more than any other state in the nation. Yet we come out in the middle in the rankings. We come out between number 20 and number 30 state in the NAEP test results. Which
So that's not very impressive for that kind of
shows that money
expense.
is not the single biggest critical factor in quality. And by the way, the only area that beats all 50 states is Washington, D.C. in spending, and they come out in last place. They come in 51st place.
That's
and,
fascinating.
so money is not, you know, you have to have some minimal amount, but money is not the key factor. A lot of other factors that would apply. So in New York, this is a crisis. The property taxes are killing New York. The suburban property taxes in particular are the highest in the nation, and we have, I think, the most expensive counties in terms of taxes paid in the United States of America. The top counties are New York State counties: Nassau, Suffolk, Westchester, and so forth. So we've got to deal with this problem. It's a critical one. I'd be interested in hearing what George has to say.
George, you want to jump in?
Well, Frank hit it on the head. We spend more in education in New York than any place in the nation, and the numbers aren't good. And what is driving this is the fact that the teachers and the administrators are getting paid huge salaries that are out of proportion to what they really should be, in my judgment. So to get back to the pension issue for a second, if I may, we're now facing a situation where, again, pensions were given to people. A cop retired at 40, got a modest pension. He was dead when he was 50. Now we got cops retiring at 40 years old and getting a 60, 70, 80, 90, $100,000 a year pension, no state taxes, no local taxes, no Social Security contribution. And
they live longer.
And they live longer. And so the system can no longer sustain itself. When it comes to the field of education, teachers coming out and superintendents coming, we have superintendents of Long Island coming out with a $250,000 pension. So what is happening? Those pensions are protected under the New York State Constitution. Any pension deal you get can never be taken away from you. In addition, within the state constitution also says that you never can pay state taxes on this, because I thought, hey, how about just taxing them? But they covered that base too. So you have several alternatives. In New York State, they've started various tiers. I think we're up to tier 6. So tier 1 people, tier 5, tier 5. Tier 1 people contributed nothing. Tier people, after the New York City collapse and they realized they had to do a few things, they started these tiers. But it doesn't come to grips with the problem itself, because it's all new employees coming in. So if you make even dramatic changes now, you still got to pay out what's owed for all the people who are presently on the payroll.
It's still very unbalanced.
It's very unbalanced. So we're going to see, as I mentioned earlier, expenditures in school districts continue to go up dramatically, which means taxes are going to continue to go up. And you can only push this envelope so far. If you go up to upstate New York, you'll hit towns in Scolari, New York. Average home is worth about $125,000. The median salary is about $35,000. And on a $125,000 house, the taxes, combined county and school taxes, $6,000. Now, if you're making 35 grand a year, that's a lot of money. Now, we complain on Long Island because we're paying 12, 14, 15, 16, 20,000. In town of Hempstead, I'm paying about 12,000 in taxes in the New Heights Park School District, but the median salary in town of North Hempstead is about 110,000.
It's a little closer to proportional.
But it's still a lot of money. And we have, because young people are not moving back to the area, old people, the districts are getting older and older, and seniors now on fixed income can't swing this kind of money. You're reaching a point where your entire Social Security check is going to pay school taxes and the insurance on your home. It cannot sustain itself. And numbers will continue to go up because education spending, even with the cap, which is a good thing, the pension contributions will be exempt. And that's where the great increase is going to be coming in the coming years, because the day of reckoning has arrived. So you no longer can give these generous pension payouts to people who are making more money than the private sector. It used to be the reverse. It's not that way anymore. So you're getting the best of all worlds. You're getting big salary, great security, big pension, while the private worker is like no pension, lousy health care.
It's really insane. And it's even more ironic when you look at the percentage that go on to college and the percent that graduate and the SAT scores among some of these school districts. Yeah. They're not improving to keep up with this dramatic increase in expenditures.
Spending is going up, SAT scores are coming down, which proves the point. Frank is 100% correct that spending money alone is not the answer to good education. The parochial schools have traditionally spent about a third of what the school districts are spending, and turning out kids, sadly, Rice High School, run by the Christian Brothers of Ireland, graduated its last class yesterday. The school is closing after 70 years. They just can't do it on $7,000 a year tuition because parents can't afford that. It was basically 90% minorities who went to the high school. The graduating class yesterday, there's a picture in today's New York Times, states 100% of these kids are going to college in this graduating class. Phenomenal record.
Very impressive.
And it's closing because you just can't do it anymore. And so the sad part is the private education, because there are no voucher systems or scholarship systems, they are dying, and they're dying in the areas that need them best, where parents put their kids on waiting lists to get into the parochial schools in Harlem, the South Bronx, because they don't want their kid destroyed in the public school system, which may be spending a lot more money, but is not turning out educated kids and could ruin their lives very easily, drugs, crime, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's really, we're on a treadmill to oblivion here. And if the teachers' unions do not wake up soon, We saw a revolt, a tax revolt that started brewing last year in New York State. I think we're going to see it getting angrier and angrier, and the day of reckoning is coming. So it's going to be a great political battle because the system could no longer sustain these expenditures, be it in the education and the pension system. It's coming to an end.
For years on Long Island, a lot of families automatically vote to approve the school budgets that they're not realizing, although I think in the past couple, more school districts turned it down. So maybe the word's getting out a little bit.
Not really, because the turnouts are so low, Patty. They're like 15%, 20% turnout. So the system is designed to pass school budgets, which is killing people, fiscally. They can't afford these taxes. The school taxes are 60 to 65% of the total property taxes. But the two biggest areas, education and healthcare. Healthcare to me is much more complicated, a lot more difficult to resolve in my judgment. Education, the solution, and George was getting at it, is so obvious. We're spending
relatively simple.
$60 billion a year, roughly, in New York State to educate our 3,100,000 or so public school students, 19,000 per pupil. $60 billion when you think about this money. Our whole total budget's, I think, $130 billion. So it's almost, well now, of the 60 billion, 23 or 24 billion comes from the state. The other 60% of it comes from local property taxes, the school taxes. But it's still a tax that's paid by the people in the form of income taxes or property taxes. 20 years ago, the New York State Senate asked Ron Lauder of Estee Lauder Corporation, a cosmetic company. They appointed Ron Lauder and a committee to look at how New York State could solve its fiscal crisis in the early 90s. It was a committee set up, they called the Committee on Privatization, Commission on Privatization. And they looked at a number of areas, airports and roads and subways and railroads and so forth. And then they printed their results in the New York Times, November 24th, 1991. It was
You just happen to remember that.
I never forget it. It was a full-page ad in the New York Times, and Newsday, and a lot of papers. And they had all their conclusions and recommendations to the New York State Legislature, done at the official request of the New York State Senate. The number one recommendation, back in 1991,
when it was far less desperate.
right, it was critical, but not as critical as today, was in the area of education. They said if they went to what's called a full parental choice system, that is where you give parents, especially low-income, middle-income parents, a scholarship or voucher to pick a non-public school to go to, and accredited. It has to be accredited by New York State, but it's a private school, typically a religious school. If you went to that approach, we would have saved, back 1991, $4 billion a year. I've translated that today to $12 billion a year in savings. That would make most parents, especially African-American parents, Hispanic parents, poor white parents, middle-income parents, very, very happy to give them some flexibility so they're not obligated to pick the school in
That happens to be closest to them.
Right,
They
they
would
could-
pick the best school.
for their children, and would reflect their dress code, their behavior characteristics, their discipline characteristics.
And it would drive up competition with
and
the
force
public
the other
schools.
public schools to improve. This involves giving them less money than the public schools get. So if public school kids spending $20,000 a year, $19,000, you might only give them 30 or 40% of that amount. That's where the savings comes in. But we're talking about saving $12 billion out of $60 billion. That's a 20% reduction, while you're helping poor and middle-income parents. You're encouraging the public schools that'll have more money per child that remains, more money per pupil left, because they're only losing a fraction of the money they would normally spend on that pupil. They're giving away 30 or 40% of it. The rest they keep, and they don't have the pupil anymore. So they could spend it on the remaining pupils or give it back to the taxpayers.
It's good all around.
Everybody wins.
But it was their number one suggestion, and nothing happened.
The teacher unions are so powerful in New York State. And the ones most disgusting on this, in my view, are the Democratic assemblymen, Sheldon Silver and those people who are kowtowed to the teacher unions, even though they're elected, many of them African-American, Hispanic assemblymen and senators, elected by African-American and Hispanics who want to be able to pick the school of their choice. They're voting for assemblymen and state senators who don't support them on it and who say, no, we're going to force you to go to the public schools where you got to pay
Even though, ironically, they're choosing the parochial schools themselves for their own kids.
And the urban poor want school choice.
They're the ones that are suffering.
And they're voting for people who won't give it to them because they're putting the teacher unions above the interests of the urban poor. It's a disgusting thing. I'm hoping that the urban poor wake up and realize what the heck they're going on, because they don't want their kids to be given affirmative action benefits, in other words, preferential treatment and getting into
Right,
college.
it's all phony.
They just want good
As
education
soon as it's
opportunity.
explained to them, they want the
They
voucher
want it.
program.
They want to be able to pick the school that's best for their child, but they're voting for liberal Democrats who oppose that, who favor the
holding it
teacher
up.
unions instead.
George, now what about the national front on the educational issue?
Well, the moral of the story is here, the whole mentality on a national level, a state level, is that the answer to our problems is more money. If you listen to Paul Krugman of the New York Times or read his column, if you have the patience to do that, or listen to him on ABC News every other couple of weekends,
It's always
his
more
answer
money.
is more money. Well, how come the stimulus doesn't work? Not enough money. What about this? Not enough money. How come kids aren't? Not enough money. So it's been a mindset since the days of the Great Society in the 60s
That must be the problem.
answer to all problems is money. And the numbers show something specifically different. It's very difficult to deal with the national level because, on the one hand, if we demand national standards, we may not like the standards that are being forced down our throat. So, I take the position that if there is going to be federal funding to money, it should be in block grants and let the states and localities choose how they want to use that money. I'm concerned about a Department of Education that suddenly will put out a catechism of general set of rules of how you're going to educate your kids, and we may not like it. And considering the present crew that are in Washington, I'm sure we won't like it. So we got to be very careful. I happen to subscribe to the approach that when it comes to Medicaid, which is bankrupting a state, the federal government should give block grants to the state of New York and give us more flexibility in the kind of programs we have. When you take a look at education in New York State, we're spending more than just about every state in the nation. When you look at Medicaid, we are spending more than Texas and California combined. And California is not exactly a
Small state.
a small state or a red state, but we're spending all that more. So if you get more flexibility to control it, and if you get dollars from the federal government, I'd rather us decide than them decide for us. So it's a very difficult situation and how we approach this, because even
point.
Republicans come up plans, let's have a national education plan. Nah, I'm not crazy about that, because anybody can come and change it, and then you're stuck. And then they hold back the dollars. So it could add to greater problems in the long run. So it's a very, got to be very careful here on what we do
Do
with
you
the
want to
feds.
respond to that? And
Yeah,
how has
you know,
President
I
Obama
know.
addressed this, if at all?
President Obama, you would think, the first African-American president we've ever elected. And what does he do? In D.C., we had what was called the Opportunity Scholarship Program that the Republicans put in the early 2000s. It gave poor parents in Washington, D.C. a scholarship to pick a school of their choice, the school choice I was talking about. It cost less than what the D.C. students were getting in the public schools. They were spending, much higher figures there, about $17,000, $16,000. These scholarships were about half that, or considerably less. So it cost the taxpayers less money. The parents were ecstatic. They had to go through lotteries to get picked to go to the school. They limited to a certain percentage of the students that could opt out of the public schools and go to a private school of their choosing, getting half the money. And yet, who stops the Opportunity Scholarship Program that benefits primarily African-American residents of D.C.? Barack Obama and his Democratic friends in the Congress. Why did they do it? Simple reason. A lot of people might wonder, why would he do that? Because Barack
With all the
Obama had to
benefits.
choose between the urban poor, African Americans in D.C., and the teacher unions, the NEA and the National Education Association, the American Federation of Teachers, the two teacher unions. He had to choose between them. And the Democrats had to choose between the NEA and AFT on the one side,
Even after
or the
seven-
urban poor, of which he's a member of the African American community. But and then, to show what a phony he is, I mean, I hate to say this, he's got some good points, Barack, but a real phony on this. He has two daughters, two lovely daughters. Does he send them to the D.C. public
Perfect
schools?
example.
No. He sends them to some fancy private school in D.C. at a cost of $56,000, now it's probably $60,000 per
He
year.
can afford that.
He
The
can afford
average
it.
Washington, D.C. parent can't afford
And
that.
he tells his fellow African-American parents in D.C., yeah, I can afford it. I'm sending my daughters to this ritzy school.
But you have to be
Stidler's
stuck.
Academy, I think it was called. You're going to
the
have to
public
be
school
stuck in the
and
we're going to make the taxpayers pay more, because if you pick the private school, we only have to give you $8,000 a year. If you pick the public schools, we have to spend twice as much. So he screws the taxpayers, he screws the urban poor, his fellow African Americans. because he's not affected. He's sending his kids to that ritzy private school. So on that issue, Barack Obama was a disgrace.
That was not publicized enough in the
No,
mainstream media,
and I
especially
don't know-
after
yeah.
several years of the program running successfully.
And do the African American people realize it? I mean, I don't know if they know what's going on here.
Yeah.
I mean, it's the Republicans that gave them that school choice. So
That's a good point. That's
Yeah.
a good point. Well, let's move along to healthcare costs, which we touched on a little bit. George, how much of a problem are healthcare costs in the state, and what do you see as the solution?
Well, the great problem in the state of New York is Medicaid, where more and more people are getting to Medicaid, and the costs are going up dramatically. And as a result, the budget of the state of New York is driven by it. The number is about $44 billion this year, or $46 billion. And worse than that, county governments still have to pay, although there's a cap, basically paying 25% of the share. So that's what we call an unfunded mandate. In Erie County, New York, which is basically broke, every dollar collected from the property taxes goes to pay the Medicaid contribution. That's a fact. The mayor of Buffalo had the same problems because he gets, all this money that's being taken from the mayor of Buffalo several years ago called for the dissolution of the city of Buffalo because he couldn't figure out how to do it anymore. Erie County, the county executive there says, who's been trying to do a very credible job, he says, we're out of money, if it snows, this is before we got to shovel snow or do anything, all this money's going through here. So as a result, there's scores of other taxes, but these are unfunded mandates. So the state of New York is willing to give away the store in terms of Medicaid. Counties have no choice in this. Their numbers go up every year, which means their property taxes have to be pushed up every year, or cuts have to be made. So it's just really a treadmill to
A vicious
oblivion
cycle.
where it just doesn't stop. So what has to be reviewed is the unfunded mandates to states. If you're going to have to local governments, county governments in particular, if you're going to have a cap, which the governor agreement was made, it's being passed into law, that's a great thing. But there has to be part two to it. You got to review all the state mandates, unfunded mandates, because local governments are being whacked on these, and they have no choice in the matter. So it's very easy for Albany to say, yeah, we'll vote for that because we're going to stick
And then
this guy
it's
down
forced
here
on
with
them.
it. And it's forced on people. So that is a major issue there. The other thing is, and we're not going to see until Obamacare kicks in, in my company, we give Cadillac insurance to our employees. In 2 years from now, if all remains the same, we're going to be taxed for giving our employees Cadillac healthcare insurance. That to me is absurd, but that's what Obamacare is. In other words, they want everybody to have lousy healthcare insurance. Of course, the unions, an important part of negotiations for unions, be it in the private sector or in the municipal sector, is healthcare benefits. So many unions have Cadillac healthcare. They've been exempted from Obamacare. That was the buy-off to get the unions to sign on, because union delegates went home, their wife said, we like our healthcare insurance. We don't want to hassle with this. We like Cadillac healthcare
Everything's
insurance. Everything is fine with us. So they got exempted. In the private sector, however, you're going to be taxed for this. So we're doing the right thing for your employees, you're going to get hit. On top of that, we have seen, I know this from my own personal experience running a company, is healthcare insurance costs have gone on the average, 15% a year. The last 13 years I've been chairman of a company. It's becoming difficult to sustain this. Worse than that, they're complaining about increases this year, but what happened last year, when everyone thought their healthcare insurance was going to change dramatically, they got every healthcare measure done they can get done. In my own company, there were more hips, knees done last year because everybody said, this may go away. So you found people running to the hospitals last year, fearful that their health care was going to change dramatically and they couldn't get hips and this and that anymore. So that helped push the rate up.
Sure.
And Washington's saying, see, we told you they're going to increase. Well, there's only so much in a pot of money. If all the money's spent because people went to the doctors over and over and over again, then you got to find more dollars. Most healthcare companies are nonprofits, so this whole gimmick of them making all this money is a lot of baloney. But the system is geared towards forcing these rates up, and the fear of Obamacare is forcing them up more, and we're going to have less choices and poorer healthcare coverage if all this kicks in 2014. They wait till after the 2012 election if there aren't significant changes. So it's not going to be a happy time.
No, it sounds like a nightmare.
Oh, it's going to be a nightmare, and Medicare is going to get hit dramatically because the Obamacare, by its nature, has to take out a chunk of that to finance the rest of the system here. So senior citizens don't fully grasp yet that if you're happy with Medicare, it's going to change dramatically in a couple of years. Not because of the Ryan plan that everyone's dumping on in Washington, because of Obamacare, it's already structured and they'll strip out a lot of money to support other people going on to health care by having, in effect, people being forced to take medical health care. So the system, that's one of the reasons why the economy is in part of the mess we're in, is because nobody fully understands the implications of costs here. So healthcare is in deep trouble because the federal government has poked their nose into a point which is going to be disastrous if all this kicks in my judgment.
And very briefly, I think we've got to get expert advice from the medical field. Tort reform is one thing I would strongly favor because too many decisions are made by medical people, doctors, to avoid prosecution for neglect and then they're going to be sued civilly for damages because they didn't, some 1 in 1,000 shot, they didn't get the person tested for this, even though it was only 1 in 1,000, it occurred, they get sued. We need tort reform, and we need to measure the cost and relate the cost better to the quality of the output rather than the number of procedures. These are things that I have heard from medical experts, and I'm not an expert myself.
No, but he's right. If you're afraid of a lawsuit, you're going to send a person with 10 tests, even though your judgment may be the person only needs 2. But if you don't do the other 8, well, they may point a finger at you.
Someone may
and you get
say
sued.
later.
So in the state of New York, the insurance premiums are so high that A, it's forcing doctors out of New York because it makes no sense anymore. B, is the local doctor is becoming a dying breed because they rather work for a hospital that insures them. So the local doctor is basically going to disappear.
Okay, well, we only have a few minutes left, so let's jump to the major issues of same-sex marriage.
No, I was thinking of question 8.
Oh, I thought you wanted number 9. Okay. What are your views on the 2011 property tax cap for New York State?
It was brought up before George mentioned it briefly, because I want to say, and then just clarify a little bit on the pension loophole. I think this tax cap is a pretty darn good one, better than I was expecting, assuming it's going to get passed, and I think it will in the next couple of weeks. But the pension loophole, and I don't know if you understand all this, George, how it works, it's going to be different. The pension loophole, which is any amount in the increase in the rate applied to the salary. So today the rate, say, is 8% to the teacher's salary. It goes up to 11%, 3% increase. That's 1% above 2%. So they take the 1% times the salaries. That cost is going to be exempted from the tax loophole. However, that's going to be different for different districts. Believe it or not, wealthy districts are not going to be impacted as much as poor districts, because for poor districts, the tax levy is only maybe half of their budget. And so that percent increase is going to be a bigger percent on their tax levy than it will be in a wealthier district. I'm not sure that I don't think, to be honest, very few people understand this.
Right.
Yeah, but it's basically a pretty good step forward, I think, with putting a restriction. And what it's going to also do, most critically, is it's going to impose on Albany a lot of pressure from not only the people concerned about taxes, but finally the school boards to fight to drop last in, first out, where they let the newest teachers go in place of poorer performing older teachers. They got to get rid of that tenure system and let school districts make decisions based on performance. They've got to change the Triborough Amendment, which gives the teachers union a tremendous edge in negotiating contracts because it continues their step increases of 3 to 4% even when the contract expires. So there's no pressure on the teacher union to settle.
I didn't know that.
Oh, Triborough Amendment to the Taylor Law.
It's in effect an unfunded state mandate.
Pension reform we talked about.
So that would be a big change right
There's
there.
another critical bill, the Educational Investment Incentive Act, that will encourage people to make donations to public schools and private school scholarship funds. Get a 60% tax credit for donations up to $10,000, $25,000 for a corporation. You donate to, so public schools will get $165 million in donations at a cost of $100 million in lost revenue to the state.
So if you really believe in that school, go ahead and support it.
Plus, the private school scholarship funds will get $165 million, be able to give $33,000, $5,000 scholarships. That saves the public schools another $350 million. So in essence, $200 million lost in state tax revenue by these tax credits, $200 million lost, saves the public schools $500 million in costs. Everyone wins. The only ones opposed, possibly, are the teacher unions.
Once again.
Because they want the private schools to close. This is a no-brainer one. It's called the Education Investment Incentive Act, Senate Bill 2072. we've got to keep moving on these things.
That's very important. George, briefly, do you want to comment on that?
No, at the end of the day, what we're talking about in the educational system is that this cap forces school districts to reassess their expenditures. It's going to force them to come back to reality. And secondly, as I said earlier, part two is school districts are going to have to go to Albany and say, listen, you have to relieve us on some of these mandates, like the Tri-Borough Amendment, some of the others. So it's not a perfect system. At 2.5% in Massachusetts, a very liberal state, it worked up there. And the quality of education is even superior to the state of New York. So it's a terrific first step. It's not perfect, but I think it's great. Considering what the state is, this is a very good victory for the people of the state of New York.
That's right.
Well, it's good to be able to end on a note of optimism because there's so many areas where it looks very bleak and there doesn't seem to be much that can be done to impact the situation. We have just 1 more minute, so
Okay,
do you want to just briefly recap?
Well, and a couple of suggestions on Social Security. Again, and I'm a Social Security recipient. We've got to give something up. I would say they should raise retirement age maybe to 69 perhaps. Again, I don't get impacted by that, but my group, the current retirees, should take a reduction in the increase. We get an increase equal to the CPI every year. I think it should be CPI minus 1%. Just reduce our annual increases by 1%, inflation minus 1%, and that will save
help
over
a
10
lot
years,
right there.
10%, yeah.
Okay, we have to conclude now. I want to thank you, gentlemen, Frank Russo and George Marlin. Thank you for being our guest tonight, and thank you for joining us. If you want more information on United New Yorkers for Choice in Education, please call 516-292-1224. It's P.O. Box 4096, Hempstead, New York, 11551. Or this organization, the American Family Association of New York. The website is www.afany.org. Thank you and good night.
Thank you.